I wanted to just preface the panel by saying that this morning session is really about exploring the current changing realities in front of us. It's not necessarily about finding answers, and in fact, I have to apologize if some of this is not terribly optimistic. But clarity is always very good, even if it's not optimistic. The first panel, I was thinking about how these two panels are different. I think in broad strokes, the first panelist is going to try to lay out some of the problem, and the second panel will look at responses. Things are changing in the world, in our country, in our organizations. How do we need to change further? The panelists we have are chosen by the planners of the session explicitly to bring viewpoints from outside the CCIC community. I think that was intentional and really welcome. So we want to get those viewpoints as much as yours. I'm going to try to have this panel go for about 45, 50 minutes, and then leave a good 20 minutes or so for questions and comments. Two speakers here on either side of the room. Let me first introduce the panelists. You do have in your program here a full set of bios of everyone who is participating in different panels and different workshops. So look at that, and I'll just give a short resume. So we have here Gerd, to my immediate right here, Gerd Schoenwalder is the director of the IDRC Policy and Planning Group since 2009. Previously, he was deputy director of the Canadian Foundation for the Americas, FOCAL. And among other things, Gerd has worked on issues of trade as well as peace, conflict, and development. He holds a PhD in political science from McGill. Next is Richard Siwakiranga. Oh, I have that right, Richard. Is currently the executive director of the Ugandan National NGO Forum, which brings together more than 400 civil society organizations in Uganda. Civil society is very much the focus of Richard's life. He has also worked or written on poverty eradication, how to bring voices of the poor into the planning process. He's written on gender, popular urban culture, and land issues. Next is Joseph Ingram. He has become the president and CEO of the North-South Institute since August of 2010, after a 30-year career at the World Bank. Joe has worked with the World Trade Organization as a consultant to both the UN High Commission on Human Rights and CEDAW. He knows quite a bit of the world with important commitments in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Cameroons, Nigeria, and Beirut. And finally, on the far right of the panel is Carrie Polanyi-Levitt, best known for a seminal book in my life, Silent Surrender, the Multinational Corporation of Canada. Thank you, Carrie. I did pull it off my bookshelf last night. It is still a wonderful, wonderful book, reissued in 2002. Get a copy. It is really important in understanding this country. Carrie's 50 years of association with the Caribbean has resulted in the publication of Reclaiming Development, Independent Thought in the Caribbean Community. And much of her work combines the Polanyi legacy with her long-standing engagement with development. So that is your panel. I sent a little email to the panelists challenging them to a first little exercise to begin this off. To give each of them 30 seconds. 30 seconds to list, if they can, 2 or 3 of the new realities, of the changes or forces or factors in our world or in our country that we need to pay attention to because it will affect civil society. So we'll try that and see if that creates for us a little agenda for an ongoing discussion and conversation. No prepared presentations here. It's going to be a conversation. So 2 or 3 topics, just a list, in 30 seconds. Sure.
Thank you. Let me try this. I have 3 actually. First one is, you won't be surprised by that, the development landscape is changing. Everybody talks about emerging actors, China, India, Brazil. There's a host of other actors that all challenge the dominance of the traditional development actors. Second idea, the idea of development itself is changing. I would put to you that we're no longer exclusively talking about aid or assistance, but development is much, much broader. We're talking about global public goods, climate change, fragility, infectious diseases, and how to manage and how to get on top of that. And thirdly, the establishments, perhaps more relevant for you, established NGOs, established civil society organizations are increasingly being challenged by what you might call my NGO, little startup NGO that are becoming more important, especially in the humanitarian field. And that's important, if only because it might affect your ability to raise funds. Thank you.
Richard, would you give us
Your list of things that have changed that we must pay attention to.
I think I'll take the 3 he has, and then I'll add, so I'll have 6, 3 of these and 3 of mine. I think for me the first one is the youth factor globally. If you think about it, in Africa alone, 74 million jobs are required for young people in the next 10 years. We are told that up to 132 million people are living under new regimes in 74 countries, and the biggest part of that, all those new regimes have been brought about by young people. So that's the first thing that we need to think about. The second one is the expanding role of the private sector, especially the private sector from the global north, that has done many injustices by causing a financial crisis in the north that is now descending onto the developing world, accompanied by all phenomena of land grabbing, playing very big roles in the extractive industry, and changing the whole landscape of politics, development, and economics. And the last one for me is the poor performance on all international and global agri targets. We have, as a bloc, failed on the MDGs. They were supposed to be a minimum agenda, but now they are being talked about as if they are a maximum agenda. We have failed on the Paris Declaration. For all the donor countries, out of the 9 targets, only 1 was achieved. So for me, those are new realities of how those who are good performers have become bad performers, and we're wondering where the world is going to go with all the bad performers.
Thank you. And Joey.
Well, Bert must be reading a lot of my presentations and speeches because he basically happens to no, I agree with everything that's been said, and I'll try to add maybe there's not too much to add, but I think there are some things. First of all, on Bert's first point about the changing nature of the development agenda, some people, especially in some of the think tanks, Nancy Birdsong, the Center for Global Development, is talking about the end or the beginning of the end of the development agenda. And that is a major trend taking place, and this is something that Gert was referring to. In other words, we're moving into a different agenda, and he talked about the increasing focus on global public goods and global public bads. And the development is becoming much more about how you manage and mitigate those public goods and those public bads. And so domestic government policy is being increasingly influenced by, and the solutions to many of the challenges domestically are increasingly going to be found at the global level, which has implications, of course, for the future of multilateral development. A second thing I wanted to add, I think, is that which they haven't talked about, is the decline in overseas development assistance. In 2011, for the first time in basically 11 years, there are steady increases globally in official development assistance. In 2011, globally, development assistance dropped by about 3% globally. In that same year, the amount of development assistance from bilateral institutions going to the low-income countries fell by close to 9%, about 9.8%. So the low-income countries are getting less from a shrinking pie globally. And what's happened in Canada, we should say, in terms of budget cuts, the CEDA and IDRC is part of the global trend taking place. There were some 16 of the OECD donor countries in 2011 whose aid budgets dropped. So what happened here is part of a larger trend. Third, we've had a majority government elected in Canada. And it's a government which is not big on international development, no matter how you define it, and is using as an instrument of foreign policy trade and investment, as well as defense, much more than official development assistance. They're very mercantilist in their outlook, and they want Canada to become, as some have said, a warrior nation. And I think this spells trouble for at least the development agenda as we've known it. And I'll stop there before I put my foot too much on that.
But very briefly, we did get Canada in there. I think it returns that momentarily. Carrie.
Well, I think the first thing that I would say has come to loom over the scene, particularly I think in the last 10 years, is the enormously growing power and concentration of financial and corporate capital, most visibly within the United States and our own country and also in Europe. And I see this somewhat aggressive extension of activities of multinational corporations. Somebody mentioned my book, Silent Surrender, written 40 years ago. I think the theme has come back on the agenda, and it should come back to be studied in the way it was in the 1960s and 70s. What really are the economic and political implications of permitting large foreign companies into one's territory, and what are effective means of for governments to negotiate with such companies to the best advantage of the country. This is a theme that was very much discussed in the 1970s, in the times when we still had the United Nations Center for Transnational Corporations, so my second theme then is in terms of building resistance to this expansion of global capital into the global south. I think we should return to some of the literature, some of the themes of the 60s and 70s before this neoliberal tsunami came on the road. And they include issues of inequality in a development context. In other words, the negative aspects of inequality. It is not only that a more equal society is a social gain, but it is also a condition of development. And the issue of employment, which has really almost gone off the screen. And there is here, I think, a very serious problem, and has to do with technological change, which is reducing globally the demand for labor to produce goods. If I give you one figure only, which is that China doubled its industrial output without any increase in employment. And very similar figures come out of India. So therefore, it is a challenge for the development community, which is a challenge which the ILO has really refused seriously to take up. How people can access what the Amartya Sen called their entitlement to the product, so to speak, because the regular wage employment model, it is there, but it is not going to be available to all working people who come onto the labor force.